Good evening, everyone. I'm Paul Skinner, founder of MarketingKind, and welcome to this MarketingKind exchange, in which we'll explore how greater fairness might save us from the climate emergency, with our special guest, Tony Juniper, CBE. Now, at MarketingKind, of course, we love to talk to people with big ideas that can change the world, or extensive experience of leading change in practice. Now, I don't know if Tony has ever been described as a two-for-one deal before, but he has both led change and defined the ideas that have shaped it for over 40 years. He's worked from outside, inside, and across the system, having been executive director of the campaigning group Friends of the Earth for England, Wales, and Northern Ireland, and subsequently vice chair of Friends of the Earth International. Having worked as a scientist on conservation, having advised major global businesses, having at one point stood for election, and now advising government ministers on their decisions. Tony currently chairs Natural England, working to conserve and restore our natural environment. He's also a fellow of the Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership, which many of our members are familiar with. He chairs the charity Cool Earth, is a trustee of Fauna and Flora International, and sits on the Impact Advisory Committee of Union Bancaire Privée, where he oversees their pioneering investment in biodiversity recovery. His 12 books include the multi-award-winning What Has Nature Ever Done for Us?, The Science of Our Changing Planet, and Harmony, co-authored with the then Prince of Wales, now King Charles III, which I believe will be re-released in the coming weeks to celebrate the launch of the King's documentary on finding harmony, which people can watch from the end of this week. Tony's latest book is, of course, Just Earth, How a Fairer World Will Save the Planet. And I've enjoyed both the hardback and the audiobook version, which Tony narrates himself. Welcome to MarketingKind, Tony. How are you feeling this evening?
Yeah, thank you, Paul. Yes, I'm feeling as though 2026 is off to an interesting start and finding that quite a few of the themes that are in Just Earth are very timely to consider just at the moment in witnessing this challenging polarization of the climate and environmental agenda and just looking at the context of all of that and how it does play back into these big questions of social inequality. And so a very topical issue as we struggle to keep things on track just at the moment and to just register the social and economic dimensions of all of that, because this is very, very far from being simply an environmental issue as we sometimes are encouraged to see it.
Yeah, totally. When Mark Carney said that nostalgia isn't a strategy and said we face a ruptured world order,
Yeah.
what does that mean for the nexus of fairness and climate?
Well, I think we're all working that out at the moment. But one thing I think that is very interesting is that the power imbalances that lie behind the climate and nature emergencies and our patchy ability to deal with them thus far, those power imbalances, they are becoming more visible to people. And I think that's important as a prelude to people wishing to act in a way which is going to be more effective and questioning some of the assumptions that have lain behind how the world works for so many decades is something which may open some opportunities. And this idea of a rupturing world order and a period of rapid change now being upon us, it does feel like a crisis. And in many ways, it is a crisis. But at the same time, might this be a huge opportunity? Because if you think about what we're dealing with and the mismatch between rising human demand and our struggling planetary systems, it's big change that's needed to be able to fix that. And this moment of clarity, you might call it, where we can see laid bare the way the world has been working, I think may enable some change on a scale that wasn't possible before. So yes, those remarks from Mark Carney, I think, were very important, and I'm sure he won't be the last person during the course of 2026 to be reflecting on the scale of change that's underway.
Yeah, I think maybe we'll come back to that, because in your book, you talk about the need to mobilize to deal with the climate emergency at a sort of scale of mobilization that maybe we haven't seen since World War
Yes.
II. And yet, it's possible that the challenge is even bigger than that, in that maybe we've gone from a post-war order to some kind of pre-war or some kind of level of disorder, which is
Yeah.
really quite extreme. And so that
Yeah.
increases, it's a bigger problem to solve, but on the other hand, it may be a less ignorable problem to solve.
Yes, exactly that. And it was always a big problem, but because it was contained as an environmental issue, which was about an argument between whether we burnt a bit more gas or whether we switched to wind turbines, we're moving beyond that. And that is necessary and was necessary. And so, perhaps now we begin to have a discussion which is at a more realistic level in being able to, lean into these questions. And perhaps as part of that, a questioning of how we organize societies and what might be an alternative that will work as the world rapidly warms and as we have billions of people living in poverty and as we see the impacts of climate change beginning to influence food production and water security and these kinds of things. There is going to be a need to think about how we do things differently. And I do explore some of that towards the end of the book in terms of, what the big ideas of the future might be, because, you can see this in the United States big time. You see it in Europe and elsewhere. This proposition whereby we are encouraged to think that there are two ways of looking at the world. There's a left-wing view and a right-wing view. I think the moment we're in enables everyone to see actually, neither of these things are fit for purpose in terms of their historic form. So capitalism in its current guise, it is causing resource depletion, pollution, driving massive inequality, which then feeds back into making solutions to those challenges more difficult. Socialism and communism have a even worse environmental track record. If you look at the Soviet Union and the way that country abused its environment in order to industrialize in ways that were seen as rational for the improvement of well-being, which actually didn't necessarily improve well-being very much. I think we are at a moment when we need to start thinking about some alternative, very big ideas that can help us organize for the future. And I present as one thought in the book at the end the idea of Thrivalism, because I do think isms are important for politics, and socialism and capitalism have become organizing themes, one word ideas that convey a lot. What could Thrivalism convey? My definition is 10 billion people thriving on a living planet. And that by mid-century is what we will need to be doing, because the population by then will be 10 billion people. How can they thrive on a living planet? What kind of economic and social system and ecological awareness is going to be needed to do that? That is the key question, not whether socialism should replace capitalism or whether capitalism can be a bit greener. I think that conversation is a massive distraction. And it's obviously, it is deployed in order to polarize and to divide people. Can we find a hopeful vision for the future, which will lead to human well-being thriving alongside a living planet, which is coming back to life? The soils and forests and fresh waters are replenished. And as we diminish greenhouse gas emissions, and as we focus very much on people being happy rather than consuming more stuff, which is the trap that we're in at the moment.
Yeah. So in a sense, for 10 billion people to thrive, I mean, it's theoretically plausible. It could be done.
Yes,
It requires a high level of intelligent collective decision making.
it does.
It feels that we're moving away from
We are.
positive sum world towards a zero sum world where that kind of quality of collective decision making is diminishing. Is that something that you fear, and how might we turn that around?
Well, this is the point really, in Mark Carney's speech and events that unfold in the news agenda every day now. We are constantly reminded that we don't have that enlightened collective decision making. We have arguments between factions, which are not leading to the kinds of solutions that we need. And so how we build that alternative vision. I think it is about collective action derived from literally a movement of people who wish to work together to achieve a different set of outcomes. And actually, when it comes to big ideas and how they are spread, I do draw some inspiration from Milton Friedman's efforts, a free market economist who, during the 1960s and 70s, was a fringe voice who had little traction, wasn't taken that seriously in the mainstream, but whose ideas came to prevail to the point where they are the collective wisdom that we use to organize pretty much every Western economy in the early 21st century. And he went from a fringe figure to his ideas being fully embraced because he had a plan. He built a movement of newspaper editors, of academics, of political parties, and he brought those people together in ways where they advanced an idea, which was a vision, which then became dominant through clever framing, through communication of simple propositions about free markets, deregulation, small government. And can people who are committed to a new future, a different future to the one that we are presently embarked upon, can we muster the collective cleverness to be able to do something comparable? And I think that would be an interesting thing for folks who can see the position we're in and the opportunity for the future to be thinking about that together now.
Yeah, and it's a great challenge for us because Milton Friedman was an economist.
Yes.
And in a sense, in promoting the maximization of shareholder value, whenever you have a number that strips away context, you essentially take away the story and you're only left with the number. And
Exactly.
so as a community that believes in the power of narrative, a marketing oriented community, we ought to be able to see a way to put context back in and
Exactly.
reclaim some of that power and agency. But in terms of standing up to economists and not letting them have always their own way, even in economic thinking, conservation scientist by background. So what led you to write a book primarily rooted in the socioeconomic issue of fairness?
Yeah, so I started life as an ecologist, and I still am an ecologist. And that is a discipline which is about understanding the natural world and being a conservation oriented ecologist and seeking solutions to extinction, ecosystem decline, loss of ecosystem function. Especially during my time at Friends of the Earth, you're constantly brought into contact with these wider prevailing forces that are beyond the scientific discipline of ecology. And, you know, the one that's there for everyone to see at the moment is nature protections getting in the way of economic growth. I mean, this is the framing that's in the newspapers every single day of the week. And I deal with that in different roles that I have. And that is a juxtaposition of ecology and economics in a way whereby these two things have become disastrously separated to the point where we're invited to make a choice between having a functioning life support system on the planet or growing consumption of, you know, cars, carpets, consumer goods, and, you know, the growth machine that relies on increasing all of that. And so if you then look at the reasons why we have economic growth as such a high priority, one of the reasons why it's there is because we haven't done enough to ensure the equal distribution of wealth over the last 50 years. And we have a lot of people now who are poor and who are struggling, and there's a cost of living crisis. And because much of the wealth has gone to a very small minority of people, I saw a statistic the other day that says that 12 billionaires now control more wealth than the bottom half of humanity. So the 4 billion least well-off people on planet Earth now control less wealth than a number of individuals you could fit into a minibus. And so, you know, the economic and social dimensions to this, they are unavoidable. They have to be confronted as part of any credible plan to be able to solve the environmental issues. That's a conclusion I reached over a long journey. I've been on this work now for 42 years in a professional capacity, and longer as an interested youngster who paid attention to some of these things. And so this is not something I started with. You know, we need to think about different economic ideas and ways in which we can share wealth more evenly. That wasn't my starting point. My starting point was as an ecologist, as an environmentalist, but it was during my time at Friends of the Earth in particular, and especially working with counterparts from Friends of the Earth organizations in Africa and Latin America and in the poorer parts of Asia, because those organizations working at ground level, they were very aware of the social inequalities being the main problem. Whereas in the West, quite a lot of the conversation was around policy and, can we ban this chemical? Can we have a target for greenhouse gases? Can we be slightly greener consumers and put a 5 penny tax on plastic bags? All that stuff was going on here. Whereas in Colombia or in Ecuador, the campaigns were going on between communities and mining companies who were extracting the resources to turn into the consumer goods that we were arguably going to consume in a slightly greener way in the West. And so that juxtaposition of circumstances with those groups working in the developing countries, that certainly did inform my thinking and challenged me to wonder whether we as Western environmentalists were on the right track. And actually, since then, things have moved on. And, in the West now and in this country, inequality now is a major environmental issue here, not least because of the extent to which it informs the policy space. And so, again, just look at the newspapers every day. There's stories there which argue, for policies to encourage cheap food. And cheap food assumes that we don't pay attention to the environmental issues. So if we go down the organic or the regenerative route, this is for rich people, when in fact what we must do is focus on people who can't afford enough to eat. Thereby we strip out the environmental standards in order to produce food as cheaply as possible. You look at the question of energy. It's misinformation to the most part, but it still works because there's a cost of living crisis going on. People talking about net zero massively ramping up the price of electricity. It's not true, but because we live in such an unequal society now, it does work in a political sense. And similarly with water, we are now seeing the consequences of there being massive underinvestment for 3 decades in our water system, to the point now where the rivers are routinely loaded with large amounts of sewage because we didn't make the investments. And one of the reasons we didn't make the investments was because we wanted to keep the bills low. That was the political direction to the water regulators. Don't worry about the environment so much, focus on cheap water. And so all of these things, they've got a social context to them. And being able to say that that exists is really quite an important thing, I think, as we struggle along looking for growth in a divided society with the environment degrading and getting worse year by year. And that's not going to change, I don't think, or at least not change very easily until we can change the conversation. We can have a different discussion going on about how we simultaneously meet human needs, especially improving the lot of people who are least well off, and improving environmental conditions in ways that are going to benefit them, not just people who've got access to a car and who can drive to a national park, for example. So there's a lot bundled in here in this space. And I think, the book I wrote really was an attempt just to open up this a little bit, just get a conversation going, which is what we're having today. So that's great. Thank you.
Yeah, and in terms of that conversation, I mean, you talk about your inspiration from different parts of the world. One thing I found remarkable is how extensive your worldview stretches. In that, if I think about the people you talk with, so on the one hand, you've spoken with smallholder farmers from Cote d'Ivoire, for example, among the poorest people in the world. You have a friend, Vandana Shiva, for whom property is literally theft. She defends the rights of indigenous communities whose land has been expropriated. But on the other hand, you've co-authored, I think, more than one book with the now king, literally by any standards, one of the wealthiest and biggest landowners, certainly in this country, but globally as well. What's the key to having a vision for change and that kind of conversation that is actually going to work?
Yeah.
Right across society?
Well, that's a good question, Paul. And I think that part of the answer to that is that we need to get a very broad body of support for it. And I took quite a lot of I put quite a lot of effort in the book into not making it an attack on the rich. Because a big part of the problem we've got at the moment is polarization and repeated attempts to pitch one group in society against another group in order to make some kind of political advantage. And you can see it going on here at the moment. And immigration is one of the wedge issues that's put into that space. And I don't think that helps enormously. And also observing the fact that if you do want big change, then the people with most influence and most power are the people who are going to help you deliver it most quickly. And so what I've tried to write is a book that is not an attack on one group, but which invites those with the power to act, including those with great wealth, to be part of the solution. And I would say that King Charles is one of the few people in the world who really gets this kind of storyline. And indeed, I was lucky enough to write a book with him years ago called Harmony, which is coming out again, as you said, in paperback later this month to coincide with his new film called Finding Harmony. And you will see in there echoes of what is in this book. The two, in some ways, are exploring quite similar ground, coming from different points of view. But the people on the ground in Africa, from what I've seen of King Charles's work over the years, he has enormous empathy for people who are struggling on the front lines of climate change, whose soil has disappeared and therefore they can't produce food and make a living anymore. He spends a lot of his time visiting flood victims, the people at the front line of climate change. And, creating that sense of empathy between the very well off and the least well off is part of the process that we need to embark upon.
Yeah. Let's dive a little bit deeper into some of those economic underpinnings. So if we think about fairness, and we need to enable a form of prosperity that enables everyone to thrive. And typically when people talk about the value creators, particularly if they're a politician, they mean the private sector. And we think of capitalism and we think of corporations as being vehicles for creating value. And often they have been historically and are. But at the same time, you specifically put your finger in the book on how too often, and at particular moments in history, most recently, the history that we're living through since about the late 1970s to the present day at an accelerating rate, have been too much about concentrating wealth rather than creating wealth. Is there anything more you'd like to say on that?
Well, I think the first thing to just reflect on a little bit is the notion of value creation. Mm-hmm. And the extent to which, if you look at some of the Victorian industrialists who, were the big actors in the Industrial Revolution, they put a lot of effort into not only building factories but also social capital in terms of workers' homes and places for them to have recreational opportunities and thereby to be healthy, to be workers. And so they weren't only focusing on profit as a value proposition, they were looking at the society in which they were working and improving the conditions for people who they relied upon as part of their value creation. And I think the point we've reached today, and and it's obvious to anyone who pays attention to the financial system, the value proposition now has become dominated by financial returns, when in fact the private sector arguably can be bringing so much more than that, and it does bring much more than that. And in fact, you look at all the things that we enjoy in Western society now, the innovation and creativity of private sector leaders is what has created an awful lot of that. But we've become very used to rewarding that set of benefits through one prism, which is finance. And the social capital that is needed for society to continue and to thrive, and the environmental capital which underpins both the economy and society, these things are excluded from the way in which we talk about value creation. Which is why, towards the end of the book, I have a few thoughts there about things we might do differently. And one of the things I suggest is to be looking more towards purpose-driven organizations that are delivering social and environmental benefit as part of their corporate purpose. And so profitability remains necessary in order to be able to create the return needed for investment in future business strategy. But that's not the point. The point is to be able to improve conditions for people and for nature. And so that is quite a shift in understanding. But I draw on others who've spent a long time working on all of this to be able to create a little sense of where the agenda is going. And there's a lot of work going on in that space, and indeed now a few companies who have adopted this kind of purpose-led strategy. But it is still quite niche, and it's not as wide as it needs to be. But what value do we want, I think, is the ultimate question. Do we want to create more wealth that can finish up concentrated in the hands of a very small number of people globally, a few thousand billionaires? Or are we trying to create wealth and benefits that come with it that are going to improve lives of everybody at the same time as protecting and restoring the planet's life support systems? That's a very different proposition. And the pathway to that, I think, really, it starts with, exactly this question: what are we trying to do with the private sector? Is it simply to create wealth? And if and even that, of course, if you look at the way the wealth is distributed, then you takes us back into an earlier part of this conversation about the extreme inequalities that now exist.
Yeah, I don't think you cite it directly, but your book refers to, on that topic of purpose-driven corporations, the sort of not quite fully there, but the PAS 808 step towards a new standard for purpose-led businesses, which for anyone here or listening later to the recording, we did one of our exchanges on PAS 808 with Polly Mackenzie, who was one of the early adopters of it. And one of the key questions is, of course, how to mainstream that approach, because if anything, it might appear that purpose-driven enterprise is, stepping backwards rather than forwards. So there's a big question around how you make that more mainstream. But Polly's essential argument was that the model that you create money in the private sector and then some of that goes in the form of taxes to tackle problems is now broken, because the problems are so big that you need a different type of relationship with the public and private sector, such that you're avoiding problems in the first place with your core activities.
Yes, that's right.
Let's dive in for a moment to the question of consumerism, because I think we're pretty familiar with the notion, particularly as we're a marketing community. And I think we're pretty familiar with the idea of consumerism posing a problem for the environment, because it's extracting resources from nature, leading to carbon emissions, toxins, plastics. But is that also, how does that exacerbate and play into the notion of fairness and equality as well? Is consumerism a double threat in that sense?
Yes, there's a lot packed in there. I mean, part of it is cultural and part of it is practical. On the practical side, there is only so much atmosphere, so much land, so much water, so much resources that we have on the earth. And the truth is that a minority of people are using up a vastly disproportionate amount of that environmental capacity in conducting lifestyles that are quite damaging to the environment. And if everybody does that, then we're going to be even further over the edge in terms of the environmental impact that's being caused. And we're already using up, I think, 2.5 planets worth of environmental space each year. And if you get all of humanity up to what the top 2 billion or so are doing at the moment, then it's going to make this 4 times worse. And so, consumerism and that excessive, thoughtless consumption of, quite often unnecessary materials and energy, this is something that is, by definition, it's unsustainable. And so then that poses some practical questions around how we switch to renewables and a circular economy and everything else. But it does pose a big cultural question because this has become so embedded over the last 50 or 60 years that it is now barely thought about. I describe our culture as being a bit like the air we breathe or the water a fish swims in. We barely notice it. It's around us at all times. And so how we begin to switch that cultural norm to the point where people can see that actually it's nicer, it's better, it's more positive to use less stuff, to be reusing, to be getting things repaired. That is a cultural job as well as being a practical one that you see in policy and everything else. And actually, I do identify the marketing profession as being the people who probably are best placed to be able to think that through and how we go from A to B at the same time as enabling companies to create wealth and other value for society in a way which makes sense from the point of view of a business. So that's the exam question for marketing, I would say.
Well, so there's a brilliant example of interesting marketing on that topic of culture change from the Prussian government in exile during the War of Liberation against Napoleon. The government needed to raise money, and they asked aristocrats to send in their gold and silver jewelry. But their masterstroke as marketers was to send back replacement items of jewelry made of iron. It became known as Berlin iron, with patriotic slogans inscribed, such that it became an embarrassment to wear gold and silver jewelry. It became a badge of pride to wear your patriotic Berlin iron. And so I think there is a cultural challenge. And maybe we'll come back to that. But let's suppose we can solve that cultural issue. And so we can overcome consumerism. And there are attractive alternatives to consumerism. But given how dangerous the world is becoming, and the somewhat inevitable need to borrow more money to pay for defense at a time when we have aging populations, overstretched public services, and that borrowing is only means repaying. Are we still hooked for economic growth, even if we grow out of consumerism, but just to keep people safe and healthy? Do we still, where do you sit on the economic growth question? Is it something that realistically we still need? And how do we square that with the challenge?
Yeah, so I've thought about this a lot, as you might imagine, and been exposed to quite a few, discussions over the years with colleagues in the environmental movement about, whether we should pursue a zero growth economy or degrowth is the phrase that's used. And I've reached the conclusion that actually this would be a mistake in a number of ways, and that what we should instead do is to argue for different measures of growth. And so the things we want to grow are happiness, social cohesion, health, longevity, education. Those things are obviously very human kind of facing growth kind of metrics. We wish to grow efficiency in terms of how much environment we need to use up to achieve food security, water security, and housing and everything else. We would want to grow the capacity of nature to be able to absorb the impacts of climate change. And we also would wish to grow wealth, and we would wish to grow the distribution of that so that it's more equal. And, all of those things you can put together to create different measures of growth that go beyond GDP. And at the moment, we are obsessed with GDP. Now, it's very interesting. You go back to the 1930s and 40s and look at the commentary that came with the first GDP metrics that were being put together. And the economists who originated that, they said to the politicians, what you must not do is use this as an overall measure of progress because it's measuring a very specific thing. And you must not fall into the trap of seeing GDP growth as being good for everything because it isn't. And of course, history shows that those warnings went unheeded, but perhaps, revisiting some of that thinking from the economists who invented GDP and to remind everyone that actually, there are other things that we need to measure besides that. I think that might be quite a fruitful discussion. And I do in the book touch on one or two examples of where people have tried this. And one that I think has a lot of potential is the idea of a genuine progress indicator, whereby you take data from all of those different things: inequality, happiness, well-being, GDP, environmental condition. You put them all together, and if you're growing all of that, great. If you're not growing all of that, you need to adjust. And I think those metrics, if you change the metrics, probably behavior would change, because we're pursuing a KPI in this sense, GDP, and if we pursued a different KPI, then perhaps we would go towards different decisions. But that conversation's come in and out of focus over the years. It's kind of very much out of focus at the moment. And I think, because of the economic squeeze that we're in right now, there is a particular difficulty in being able to raise those kinds of questions. But again, as I said earlier, I think we are in a time where reflection may become more possible, this kind of deep reflection, considering the crises and the challenges that are on the table at the moment. The other thing about defence and the dangerous world that we're in, the other thing that we lack at the moment, compared to previous times like this, maybe in the early 1940s, late 1930s, that sense of collective endeavour. Our society used to have a common information space whereby people exchanged ideas and information, and pretty much everybody was getting the same information. The rise of social media and the way in which the communication space has atomized, I think, makes this even more difficult for politicians now, even beyond, the economic squeeze, being able to invest in defence when not everybody is necessarily on the same page and seeing the same problems or the same threat. So there's quite a lot packed in there at the moment. And again, it's just another reminder of just how dangerous and difficult a time we're in right now. It's unprecedented.
Yeah, it's when you raise the topic of the information environment,
yeah,
as you, I think, point out at one point in the book, as an ecologist, that to understand the topsoil, you have to understand the bedrock on which it's formed. And our economics depends on our politics depends on our culture. And so if we have a culture influenced by a small number of quasi-monopolistic technology companies that are actively profiting by separating us and polarizing views rather than bringing us together, do we have a chance to have those kind of sensible conversations and
exactly
upwards?
Yeah, exactly. We've never been here before, and that is important to register, I think.
Do you think, thinking about parallels, since you've opened a space where we're looking at both environmental issues and issues of economics and fairness at the same time, are there parallels to be discovered? For example, in the environment, we think of, on the climate emergency, tipping points. So it could be very dangerous moments when suddenly things get considerably worse in that case.
Yeah.
The tipping points when it comes to inequality. I mean, is there a point where an economy becomes like a Jenga tower that is just too many pieces at the top and it just collapses, or is there a resilience argument to be built here?
Yeah, I think historians would be able to point to previous societies that became very top heavy and then collapsed. I mean, one of the things that is, I think, remarkable about the current position is the extent to which this accumulation of wealth amongst very few individuals, it does seem destined to destroy the very system that created that inequality. because the people at the bottom, there will come a point where they can no longer afford to buy all the things needed to generate the growth to enable the people at the top to accumulate more wealth. And I don't know how far away that point is, but if it arises, of course, it will create massive social challenges that might well lead to the whole thing collapsing. And that is something that seems to me to be a logical threat. If you remove the wealth at the bottom, it's going to feed through into the rest of the system and cause it to falter at least. So, yeah, does history teach us anything about that? I'm sure it does. I've actually recently been thinking back through history and just looking at moments of great crisis and great change, because you mentioned tipping points and, whether we can learn anything from nature in the social realm. And I did a while ago ponder whether, social change is a bit like a river system. And so you can look at a river and it kind of seems to flow gently through the landscape. There's meanders and bends, and it looks very serene. And yet that river wasn't always there. And if you look back in its history, it was, in the past, it was 2 miles to the west in the floodplain. And the reason it's now moved is because of a massive storm that took place 200 years ago, which caused an enormous flood, which caused a hill to collapse, which pushed the river to the other side of the floodplain. And that was a moment. And that river, which has been flowing for centuries, it moved in a very short time as a result of a big disruption to the system. And I wonder if that might apply to the way in which social change occurs. Does it occur slowly and incrementally? And I think it does at times, as the river does. It meanders through incrementally and gently, but every now and again there is a shock to the system which causes a massive shift in the direction of the river. And one might apply those kinds of ecological observations into the social realm. And again, you look back through history, I mean, there are moments when things changed big time. And it, over a period of decades. And one reference point we might reflect on at the moment is the Reformation of the 16th century, and big polarization of ideas around religion in that case, and led to the 30 Years' War and all sorts of complications and conflict and loss of life. But we never called it the Reformation until like a century after the event. And I wonder, if what we're going through at the moment might be reflected back upon by historians in the future, of looking at a tipping point that occurred about now and then led to big change. And actually, it's interesting that the Reformation, I think some of the scholars who've looked at that would say that the thing that really precipitated it was the invention of the printing press and the ability to make mass communication on paper in a very efficient way, compared to, monks sitting in a monastery writing things out. And one wonders whether at the moment, we're going through a similar revolution in communications technology with the rise of the internet and social media, and what that's going to mean in terms of the historic direction of society. I was going to let this dog out. She wants her dinner, so
very good. I will use this moment to remind people that I don't have the monopoly on the right to ask questions. So
yeah. And if anyone's got any answers too, equally, please do pitch them in, because I haven't got all of those either.
Yeah, you've got quite a few. Extending this for a moment while also inviting people to gradually begin to raise their hands, but a few more thoughts. So extending the parallels a little further, if there might be tipping points socially, just as there are environmentally, you have been a campaigner. Are there things that the two worlds of social justice and environmentalism can better learn from each other in terms of their playbooks? I mean, for example, there was the interesting initiative towards the end of last year, a report backed by the G20, endorsed by 500 economists, saying that we need an equivalent of the IPCC, but to monitor inequalities. We need to think differently about how we mobilize and campaign.
Yes, we do. We do. I mean, we're in such a kind of high pace of change at the moment. I'm not sure I have an enormous amount of wisdom for campaigners about what to do because, quite a lot of what I did as a campaigner, it was in a slightly different kind of
Mm.
political and technological environment. And, probably the biggest thing I achieved as an advocate was the Climate Change Act of 2008. Which was, you might regard that as towards the end of the last period, before the financial crisis, before COVID, before Brexit kind of debates, before the polarisation that came with the internet. And that was a campaign that was about mobilization. It was about movement building. It was about bringing many disparate voices together to make the case through a positive set of arguments about the sense of reducing greenhouse gas emissions and doing that with a legal framework, which is what the Climate Change Act is. And if I tried to run that campaign now, it would be very different. And I don't know what would be the mix of tactics and strategies that would enable it. So different now is the environment, the political environment, the technological environment, the communication space. It is very different. The thing that is also different is the science. The science, paradoxically, is so much more certain. And the real world events that are now occurring, they confirm this not to be a future issue. It's now a present reality. We're in the era of consequences. And yet, even with that, it is the fact that this has become politically polarized to the point where, it's now policy amongst two of our major parties that they would repeal the Climate Change Act if they had power. And it's interesting to note, back in 2008, when we had the Commons vote passing that law, of 650 MPs, three of them objected. The rest of them voted in favour. Can you imagine that now? This is such a different world we're in. And so campaigning, I think, is in a different place. And this is why I'm inclined to think that this isn't really about any longer, or just at the moment, first and foremost, a question of which policies we should run a campaign for. This is now the moment when we have to come forward with and try to embed big ideas, that really are about system change. And, in the political realm, in the economic realm, in the social realm, in order to be able to manage the environmental realm. And so this is the moment where I think a big idea can come with some prospect of being interesting. This is not least because I think we can all see, the crumbling of the old order, economic growth. More of that's going to solve our problems, really? Do we all believe that? Who believes that? Put your hands up. Nobody, not on this call anyway.
Yeah. And also we don't really, I mean, if by we mean the UK.
Yeah, well, we as society,
what
yeah,
we describe, well, specifically for the UK and for much of Europe, what we call growth it's debatable whether it's really growth.
yes, exactly. Well, quite, yes, exactly. If you take a view of genuine progress being the thing we want to grow, we're not growing that. The environment is declining, and we've got more social uh, division. We've got greater inequality, and if you see environmental uh, health and social cohesion as two things that are positive, we're not growing. That those things are declining.
I talked about you in the introduction, just to dwell on this big idea and to pull it a little further into being. I mentioned in the introduction my perception that you've worked outside, inside, and across the system. Trying to get a big idea embedded like that, where is it easier to do that from the inside, and where you can be more discreet and more
Yeah.
trusted, and where is it easier to do that from the outside, where you
Well,
can be more unrestricted in what you say?
yeah. Well, I think by definition, a big idea of the kind I outlined earlier, something like, the idea of Thrivalism, it by definition will come from the outside. That will not come from within. It will come from a movement demanding change. Because the system, it is self-reinforcing. It defends itself. And to that extent, trying to get a big change coming from the established structures and power kind of centers, I don't think it would happen.
Yeah.
And that requires people to, raise propositions, get support for them, and then make the case for them. And that will come from a movement first. And then, if it's a good idea and it gets public support, it might get adopted in politics. It might find wealthy and powerful individuals backing it. It will then get prominence, it will then get traction, and it may begin to shape outcomes. But I don't think it will come from a government or or an established institution. I think this will come from outside.
Yeah, yeah, and I wonder, where does that leave business leaders today? Because in a
Oh,
sense, we need a different relationship
yeah.
with government for that kind of idea to take hold. Do businesses just get on with a sustainable proposition and try to be as net positive as they can in terms of their socioeconomic and climate impact?
Well, that's what I
How do
spent a lot.
businesses play a different role in public life? Because if we think of business and government, we
Hmm,
we need to work in a different way. But where government engages with business, business thinks that government is going to get in the way, is going to pick winners, is going to queer the pitch, is going to take money. And where business talks to government, it's all about lobbying for their own
yeah.
interest. So how do
Well,
we
I rest my case in terms of the current system reinforcing itself.
yeah.
Um, so, what can business do? Well, I think it's going to be enlightened individual business leaders seeing the need to change the way in which business works. And we touched a moment ago on purpose-driven companies. I mean, every now and again, actually, you do see a different dynamic, just to be fair, in terms of how the current system can respond to some of even these big things. And the Climate Change Act is a good example of that. And again, it's from a few years ago, so I don't know if this would be possible now, but it was the case when we were running the campaign for the Climate Change Act. Um, One of the breakthroughs occurred when a dozen chief executives from major British companies, including Shell, HSBC, Tesco's, they went in to see Prime Minister Tony Blair to speak with him about climate change. And the number 10 team expected them to come in and say, leave us alone, don't get in the way. We can solve this if it is true that there's a climate problem, and we will do it through the market. And they didn't say that. They came in and they said, we need an orderly long-term framework to be able to deal with this problem because it's going to affect all of us. And we need to know what the rules of the game are over a period of decades, not 6 weeks until the next person comes in here and tells us a different policy. We need certainty. And that was one of the reasons why then the British government backed the campaign for the Climate Change Act, was because of the business voice. And so, is there a way of cohering a voice of leaders from the private sector to start articulating a different way of doing things? I mean, it would need to be on a bigger scale even than the Climate Change Act in terms of what we're talking about today. But can they do that? I mean, Davos might be a place where you would hope to see some of that being discussed. I didn't get much sense of this being on the agenda there this year, or indeed any year. Um, but that would be an opportunity if some of them felt that they wished to think beyond their tenure as chief executives and to be looking to the future and the stability of the system that has enabled them to generate wealth thus far. Because in a world of collapsing food security, water supply chains being interrupted, this is not a good place to do business for the most part. Although actually what was coming through in some of the documents I've seen in those Epstein files, reveals at least some people of great wealth looking for chaos and crisis as a business opportunity, with planning for a pandemic being part of what some of those people were up to in terms of investing in vaccine manufacture and what have you, as an opportunity that they thought one day would be realized. And then if you look at the science that comes from, pandemic risk, or the science that describes pandemic risk, it's not a question of if we're going to get another one, it's always a question of when. And so you can construct business strategies, I'm sure, that would enable some at least to profit from chaos. So collapsing soils and climate change impacts on the food system. I think probably if we sat for an hour and thought through, what's the business opportunity here, we probably could come up with one. But would that be the business of a responsible business leader? Or would you invest your time instead in thinking through how we might avoid the collapse of the food system. So there's a big moral choice there actually for business people, because there's always an opportunity in chaos and crisis, isn't there? Even though for the whole system it will be painful and problematic and there will be losers. But for those who wish to plan for, ecological decline as a way of creating more value, then I'm sure there are ways of doing it.
These are some quite heavy issues. So in your book, you do talk quite frequently. You begin the story at the beginning with childhood Tony.
Mm.
And to what degree childhood Tony had a love of nature and discovery. And I wonder if those references crop up, because dealing with these kind of issues where you have to constantly go into battle, often against powerful vested interests, in situations where there are real consequences, how important is maintaining that childhood connection with nature to your own resilience and finding positivity in life when confronting really quite difficult truths a lot of the time?
Yeah, so that's the origin of why I finished up doing this work over so many years, is because of that connection to the natural world as a youngster. And I think most other people who do this work describe a similar set of youthful experiences as why they finished up working in this domain. And one of the reasons why I added some of that was just to remind people about the personal motivations that everyone has and the extent to which they come from things that people experience, and that therefore being a part of what we need to build into the process of change. And one thing that we environmentalists do a lot is to share facts with people about greenhouse gas emissions and how many hectares of forest have been cut down and how much pollution's in the river. And that touches the head, but the thing that really motivates people to make choices is about their values. And a business leader that chooses to build a business strategy based upon the impacts of climate change rather than building a business strategy that avoids climate change, that will be something that's coming from them at a personal level, and will be undoubtedly shaped by their life experiences. And so this is something we I think need to not lose sight of as we craft ways of being able to get a stronger public backing for the changes that are needed. And one of the inequalities I describe in the book is this highly unequal access to green space that exists in this country and many others. And that limits people's opportunities to experience nature firsthand, which then does, and there's data I cite on this, it does then change their the prospects for them being environmentally aware later in life. People who have childhood experiences in nature, they are more amenable to listening to environmental messages when they're older. And so that's why some of that is in the book, to augment the science about that, because there is a lot of data now which confirms these connections. So sorry, I went off a bit of a tangent there. Did I answer your question?
Definitely, very much so. So we've got a few questions that have come in, and I will I think also give Roy a chance to speak after this, if you're up for putting your question directly, Roy. And Liz has raised a question in the chat saying, as you look across your networks and communities of like-minded souls, not just in the UK, but internationally, where do you see the younger generations most engaged and active on these ideas? And where should we be looking for inspiration to find the voice of the future?
Yeah, I don't know how many youngsters have read this book. I did feel as though it might attract an audience of younger readers, given the extent to which they are more aware of all of these subjects. But undoubtedly, the energy to get the scale of change that we need, and to, have the legitimacy almost of the long-term argument, it does need to engage youngsters. And like the rest of us, they're mixed, aren't they? Some of them really care and know a lot and are engaged and are determined to make a difference, and others don't care. And I don't know if I've seen any, actually, marketing colleagues here might have more information about this, the extent to which, there is a stronger willingness to engage with all of this amongst young people compared to older people. Actually, it's very interesting. Just one little anecdotal bit of information I saw the other day is the under 30s voting intentions for the next election. The Green Party is ahead of everyone else. And, that is a political movement that embodies, the idea of looking after the environment in ways that embed social justice. And so, if that's anything to go by in terms of what political ideas are on the table at the moment, then I think that says something. And, unsurprisingly, I mean, people in their 20s now, how old will they be in the 2080s? That's 60 years away. Yeah, they'll be alive still, and they will witness what's in those IPCC reports, not to mention what's coming from the ecologists looking at, threats to food security and water supply. And that is potentially a very unpleasant world that lies in the not too distant future.
I think one of the grimmest things I heard was somebody saying, I'm an optimist, but I'm a 22nd century optimist. There's a lot there. Wade, would you be up for putting your question directly? If not, I'll just read it. But even
No, sure. I'll do that, Paul. Tony, thank you very much indeed, by the way, for everything that you've said so far. Wonderful perspective that we'll have to reflect on. I've got a question for you, and it's based on your global, putting your global hat on. So I chaired an industry task force for the Royal Society of Chemistry on polymers and sustainability. And in researching that job, which was like herding cats, I should say, I saw that the compound annual growth rate for those polymers was around 6 to 7%. And that means that the use of them doubles in the next 10 to 15 years. Now, that's driven predominantly by the consumerist middle class of China and India.
Yeah.
So much of what you and indeed I, for much of my time, are now dealing with is a global engine, which is across there in South Asia, and which is not going to change because they are simply buying the things that we already have.
Yeah.
Thoughts on that, Tony? Just thoughts from you on that. Thank you.
Yeah. So, well, part of it is cultural, as we discussed before. The machine that lies behind this rapid change in consumption patterns. It's people being exposed to new ideas, new way of doing things, and it's catching on very quickly, and it becomes very culturally embedded very quickly. And I have some hope that in China, at least, that country, they do have a level of ecological awareness and also the ability to do things that they do make it work. Like, we see with their renewable energy at the moment, they've decided they're going to do it and they are doing it. Yes. So could that country, could it say we are going to have a circular economy? And they could make it work. And so, that is the opportunity in a non-democracy with a lot of heft in terms of, their ability to change things, which would have global ramifications, because if they change the way they live, it would spread more widely just because of the scale of that country. Will they do that? I don't know. I'm not a very close China watcher in terms of what policy is going on there, although some years ago was encouraged by a major speech at the annual gathering of the Chinese Communist Party, where they talked about their long-term vision for the country being about the creation of an ecological civilization, is what they talked about. And you can see it somewhat in their renewables sector and the decarbonisation of transport. They're putting a lot of effort into that. And it's like, it's got huge scale, batteries, vehicles, solar, wind. It's putting the West to shame, really, on all of that. In terms of their consumption of resources, including plastics, which are finishing up in the rivers and then finishing up in the sea, I don't know whether there could be some greater effort there. I mean, the thing to note, just on the practical side, and people are inventing things the whole time, and it's hard to uninvent things. Like, the cheap plastic drinks bottle was something that was invented, I don't know, 30, 40 years ago. I'm old enough to remember when those things never existed. And I can tell you, society functioned perfectly well. It was very nice. And we didn't have plastic bottles. And it's become culturally embedded in a way which is really remarkable, to the point now where, as I said earlier, we don't even notice it any longer. But it is something that never existed before, and now it does exist. And it's very hard to go backwards. But can we go forwards to some kind of circular process whereby there is a zero waste society, and maybe some of that stuff taken out for unnecessary uses? I don't know. But it's going to require leadership, and it's going to require people wanting to go along with what is proposed. And we go back then, of course, to the lobbies. And, having been in many policy discussions over many years about things like even the simple idea of a deposit return scheme for those kinds of containers, industry complain bitterly and governments don't do it.
Yeah, yeah. I am an eternal optimist, and it is entirely possible that the world could be driven by China
Yes.
into a globally, ecologically sensible place.
Yeah.
A couple of very big decisions made right at the top. I don't think that's an impossibility.
No, I think you're right.
If you align that with new polymers and with a circular economy, then I think in the end we may be driven by them, frankly,
Yes,
into the place.
indeed. I think that's highly plausible.
Thank you anyway.
There's a great question from Neil. Neil, are you up for putting it directly? This is a question that...
Yeah, no, cool. No, happy to. Thanks, Tony. Fantastic, and really, really stimulating. It's kind of leveled in three parts. We had Will Hutton on here before, and I was very inspired by what he said. But from his book, he kind of pointed out that politicians are nowhere near as powerful as they used to be, because we've kind of sold off the infrastructure, and now we have regulators in charge. So that is an idea of like, well, who's really got the power to actually make any change nowadays? Because it's not really our politicians. On the positive side, from the UK, I listened to a podcast by Professor Tim Spector, who was talking about our supermarkets and how the UK is actually really quite fast at changing stuff. If we stop buying something in a supermarket, our supermarkets change very, very quickly, much more so than, say, a lot of other European countries. So that's the kind of positive thing, where maybe change can be at home. So I guess my question to the point is, if you were in charge with those kind of things and you had three big moves, or if you were briefly in charge of the country and you had three big moves to make, what would they be? What would you decide to change?
So if I was in charge of the country, what would I change? Well, one thing I've mentioned already is this measurement of progress, and our principal ways of judging whether society is improving or not. And GDP has become all powerful there. I would see if we could look to come with a different measure. Genuine progress indicator is the one which I think has some merit. Actually, funnily enough, I asked ChatGPT the other day. I very rarely use this kind of technology, but I thought if I would see if it had any use at all, and I asked it if it could measure, give me a measure of progress beyond GDP by looking at social and environmental measures too, and it said yes, no problem at all. There's loads of data, we can easily do that. So it's not a technical problem, it's a political problem. And so if I was a senior politician, I might well try and make the case for that, and to see if we could open enough space to be able to have a different discussion about what we're measuring, because I do think that's key. Another thing I would do is I would see if there were ways to encourage Treasury to regard functioning natural systems as critical infrastructure. Because if we did that, we would invest in it. So at the moment, we see energy, water, transport, communications, those are all regarded as critical infrastructure. Can we see nature and functioning ecosystems as critical infrastructure? And if we did, would we invest in it with the same logic that we put into investing in the upgrades of the power grid and the motorway network, for example? Actually, a very interesting report that people might like to look at, published a couple of weeks ago, with input from the Joint Intelligence Committee in the United Kingdom, looking at the security threats arising from the decline of nature, and concluding, quite understandably and quite logically, that there could be really quite catastrophic security risks to the country arising from the destruction of the rainforests, amongst other things. And so, you know, those kinds of big cross-cutting shifts, I think, would be extremely helpful to debate and see if we could find a way of embedding different thinking, but based upon that kind of logic. And a third thing, what would I do with a third thing? Yes, I might introduce legislation to have at least a standard for purpose-driven companies, to encourage them, and to see if we could find ways of incentivizing the city to invest in them. So I'd start with those three, and I'd probably be out of office before the end of the week. I'd try. Which takes me back to the point about, you know, this kind of big change needing to come from outside before the politicians can do it. But those are the kinds of headings I think we should be looking at.
When you said you'd be out of office in a week, I wanted to make a joke about the benefits of a benign dictatorship, but then I thought about the state of the world, and you can't make that kind of joke.
No,
you know what I mean?
No.
It's
that's right. That's right. We can't rely on it.
Amelie had specifically also raised the question in the chat of, you know, I think everyone's very impressed by what you achieved in Wales in terms of the legislation to require integrating a perspective on future generations' well-being. And she was asking how close we could be in the UK to having a different set of goals. And I guess that requires a different national vision. And that requires leaders across society and businesses and elsewhere to be calling for that. So is there anything, you know, as we run towards the end of our time with you, is there anything that you would call for us to do as marketers, or how can we collectively make it more likely that we end up with a country where we can work together towards a more holistic set of goals?
Yeah. So what can marketeers do on all of this? Well, I think an enormous amount, such as the power of the disciplines you work with. I do find, I think this is right, that quite a lot of the campaigning that does go on, the communications sometimes are lacking. And actually, having worked in the conservation and nature side for a very long time, I did see it there where, you know, the organizations were led by ecologists, and they were good ecologists, and they were scientists, and they were very logical. But when they tried to communicate with the rest of the population, it was catastrophic in being able to get a message across. And so are there ways of building bridges and links with some of the change makers and being able to work with them to equip them with the kind of insights that you know, do drive real change? I mean, some of the things that are being done at the moment to divide society, you know, this is being done with top-notch communications and psychological insight. And that is a toolkit that I think for the more progressive actors, they don't draw on it. They use their professional expertise from the disciplines they work in, ecology, engineering, pollution reduction, and therefore they don't get the impact that they need. And so are there ways of marketing being able to work in that broader ecosystem of change makers to be able to you know, increase the impact of what's already there? That might be an interesting thing to explore.
Yeah, well, that's a fabulous call to action. And actually, Mark has put in the chat the need to think holistically rather than in silos.
Exactly.
And, you know, when I introduced you, I talked about you as having worked from outside, inside, and across the system. And wherever we work today, whatever our position is, we need to understand all of those three perspectives: outside, inside, and across. And you've brought so much of that holistic view to life for us in one go. So thank you so much for that. And
pleasure.
Very much hope that the launch of Finding Harmony has the effect of re-stimulating further interest in your work and in Just Earth and in everything that comes next for you, and that you'll rejoin us for future conversations.
Thank you,
On
Paul.
the topic of future conversations, just a quick note for our members. Future conversations include our next Your Marketing Kind with Sarah Housley, futurist and author of Designing Hope, on February 24th. We definitely need hope. Our next Coffee with a Cause, which is where we collectively work on a growth plan for a different charity or social enterprise. Our next one will be with Cocoon, supporting young care leavers in London, which will be on March the 3rd. And our next exchange will be with Jitske Kramer, who is a Dutch corporate anthropologist and author of Tricky Times, which will be on March 10th. And in terms of picking up on the economic dimensions of today's conversations for later in the year, it's also worth looking forward to exchanges with the economist Sir John Kay, and also on alternative economic ideas with the former leader of the Liberal Democrats, Joe Swinson. So plenty for us to look forward to. And once again, Tony, I really enjoyed your book. As I mentioned to you before everyone connected, although it is a substantial book, when I finished it, I wished it had been longer. So thank you very much for the book, for our time together. And I hope it is the first of many conversations to come.
Very good. Thank you, Paul. And do tune in to Finding Harmony. It's out on Friday on Amazon Prime, because the King is conveying a big idea in there, actually, and it's coming from a very important place. So worth tuning in. Thank you all. Very nice to have a chat. And sounds like you've got an excellent forward program to follow up with this kind of conversation. Thanks, Paul. Thanks, Sam.
Thanks you very much, everyone.
Bye-bye.